And good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for being here. For some of you tuning in, it's morning, so we have a disparate group from across the country who are here, no pun intended. I know I really, really appreciate all of you attending and participating in today's phone conference. I still look around for a full room of people, which we'll see in the not too distant future. I'd like to first turn it over, always defer to a president. And I will not change that custom. I defer and introduce you to our president, Matt Lehman. Matt?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, good afternoon, or anything in between, depends on where you're at on the clock today. I welcome you here as well. Thank everybody for joining us. As chairman of the committee, Senator Breslin will be doing the heavy lifting today, most of the business. But before we get started, I just want to make a couple of comments on this issue as the co-sponsor of this definition of proxy discrimination. This has been a work, an effort we've put out there for quite a while, and I'm proud to sponsor this alongside with Chairman Breslin. I believe this definition represents a path forward in the work we've been doing as an organization. We had a very good meeting back in December on this issue, and I want to thank everyone that participated. We had great participation in that meeting. In my discussions with Chair Breslin, we feel confident that the proposed definition before he represents a solid work product as something that should be adopted by this committee, and that NCOIL can fulfill its role of providing guidance to the states when they develop public policy around these things. And there are two committee charges. I know Chair Breslin will touch upon this as well, but we believe it's vital that the definition of proxy discrimination recognize that there is an intentional act associated with it. This is necessary because the legal term proxy discrimination focuses primarily on the word proxy, and the word proxy already has a definition that involves volition. It's important that the definition of statute not be contradiction with the definitions understood by general society. Such a contradiction would create havoc in the industry and essentially everyone involved in the underwriting process. I also want to note that since the proxy comes with us with an existing definition, proxy discrimination needs to remain separate from disparate impact discrimination, which involves no intent. That is the thing we've been focusing around. The second charge of this special committee is to review individual underwriting factors. We may find that some of those factors have a disparate impact on a protected class, and we'll review those disparate impacts and see where they need to go from there, that is not part of that disparate impact. That would require completely separate analysis from the straightforward definition of proxy discrimination. So I said this back in December, and I think it needs to be said again. These conversations are never easy. NCOIL cannot sit idly by while decisions that are being made that affect public policy and have huge impacts on our constituents are being made. We must input and give that input as the state legislative body. State legislators are those who have been vested in the authority to make these decisions all the way back to the McCarran-Ferguson 75 years ago. I'm glad we're at this point. I give a lot of credit to Chair Breslin. I look forward to the discussion today and where we move on from here. And with that, I'll turn it back over to the chairman. He can talk about the plans for the day and the plans for moving forward. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the time you gave me this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Representative Lehman. And Representative Lehman and I, as you know, are the sponsors of the definition of proxy discrimination as it deals with an important and timely issue. We had a very good discussion in December. Lots of testimony, varying conclusions, but again, very positive, and particularly positive from a number of people who called or wrote to me just saying that it was great to see the insurance industry come together and examine issues that are very difficult to talk about and to resolve and conclude and make recommendations. The driving force behind crafting the definition in a manner which appears it's the need to explicitly recognize that proxy discrimination involves some kind of affirmative decision or volitional act by individual entities. The concept of intent is necessary because the legal
No,
term.
I just got on, actually, it's at 12 my time, so I just got on, so I got it. Okay,
Okay, they were just talking about the legal intent when you use proxy. It has some intentional usage. Well, I don't want to go too far down the getting too technical about it. I do want to spend a little time reviewing actual existing definition of proxy, which we're using. One dictionary defines it as one who is authorized to act as a substitute for another. Another definition reads, it's the authority that you give to somebody to do something for you when you cannot do it yourself. A person who has been given the authority to represent somebody else, something that you use to represent something else that you are trying to measure or calculate. The words authorized and authority involves some level of affirmatively and or intentionally granting permission to someone. The Merriam-Webster definition of authorized reads, to endorse, empower, justify, or permit, by or for, or as is, by some recognized proper authority. Contrast this intentional discrimination, which has always been prohibited, with disparate impact, which has, with certain exceptions, always been legal within the insurance industry and involves no intent. Accordingly, equating proxy discrimination and disparate impact would both contort the use of the word proxy in the phrase so as to render it inconsistent with its plain meaning and completely revamp the insurance rate-making system. Adopting a prohibited disparate impact standard for insurance rate-making analysis across the board would simply be incompatible with basic insurance principles. I strongly believe that NCOIL adopting this definition of proxy discrimination will be beneficial to not only the organization by demonstrating leadership on such an important issue, but also to states as they begin to deal with these issues in their respective state legislatures. For example, a bill was introduced earlier this week in Colorado containing the term proxy discrimination, but the bill does not define the term. Everyone on this call today knows the importance of words being defined in legislation. Undefined terms create phenomenal problems for the legislators and eventually for judges who interpret the law, the regulators that enforce the law, and those governed by the law. However, I do note that the committee's work does not end with defining the term proxy discrimination. I believe more attention should be given by the committee during its April meeting to the issues surrounding rating factors and disparate impact. As I referenced earlier, as a general matter, disparate impact has always been legal within the insurance industry. And by definition, there is no intent involved. However, based upon the committee's discussion during the December meeting, the committee should further discuss instances where there is overwhelming evidence that disparate impact amounts to unfair discrimination because of, for example, a rating factor's negative impact on a protected class. That process recognizes that in insurance, actuarial justification is the one core standard of risk-based pricing that applies to every rating factor. But from time to time, state legislators, after extensive debate, during which all perspectives heard, decide that even if certain factors can be actuarially justified, social considerations warrant that they may be exempted from the core standard or risk-based pricing. This is what happens across the country in state legislators when deciding whether or not to prohibit insurers from using certain rating factors in underwriting, such as credit score, zip code, or gender. That is the proper way to address any social unfairness in the insurance underwriting process, rather than imposing a disparate impact standard. That brings us to the format of today's meeting. We'll first hear from comments and questions from legislators regarding the definition of proxy discrimination. Once all legislators are finished speaking, we'll then hear any comments and questions from interested persons. Once all comments and questions are heard, I would entertain a motion to vote on the definition. Next, we'll follow the same format of hearing from legislators first, and then interested persons regarding the next step for the committee in our April meeting. So with that, I want to remind everybody, you don't get CLE credit for my speech. We'll move on and let's get started.
Mr. Chairman, just real briefly before we go further, this is Will. I'd just like to note that committee members, New York Assemblywoman Pam Hunter and Indiana Senator Travis Holdman are on. And also, when I took the roll earlier, that was a list of all legislators that registered for the meeting. But if there is a vote taken later, only the committee members will take a vote.
Thank you very much. So we're on to questions from legislators. Do we have a name? I'll recognize Assemblyman Cooley from California.
I want to just thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. President, for your work on this. And I want to note a very important related concept of this whole point that you were making, Mr. Chair, concerning the importance of working within a universe of sort of defined terms of known meaning. The business of insurance is one that if you enact statutes which are vague in their expression, then you can have a lot of liabilities arise during the period of time from when the onset of that statute is until they get clarified. I feel that in the area of rating, to introduce uncertainty as to on what are the rates founded really jeopardizes the capital base of insurers, because until that all gets sorted out, claims can come in and disputes can arise, and it can be a very heavy load to deal with in litigation and claims payout arising from just not having been clear. So I do feel that there is a special responsibility, which honestly only insurance-oriented lawmakers would grasp, that to introduce vagueness into the rating statutes and then pass those in states, trusting that it's going to get worked out in time, actually exposes the capital structure of insurance companies to a very significant legal issue. So it just runs in favor of being conservative, cautious, and by this I actually just mean thoughtful in how we take apart something and really examine the import of the language and the extent to which it affords clarity, so that we're not opening up a potential for legal problems. I just want to jump in and offer that observation as to sort of say amen to your introductory remarks.
I'm unmuted. Oh, I'm sorry. Next speaker. We're having a little technical problem. So if someone would like to speak, please recognize yourself now.
Yes.
Yes. Next is anyone on the committee, right? Legislators?
This is Representative Carter.
Yes.
Okay, I would just like to
mentioned the fact that when we were discussing this in Michigan, one of the questions was, could we consider gender orientation in the language?
Will?
Mr. Chairman, well, I think that question goes towards the second charge of the committee in terms of the specific rating factors. That doesn't really address the definition of proxy discrimination. So that question will be dealt with the committee's second charge, but not in this definition.
And to just put a little extra on that, Mr. Chairman, if an insurer were to use a neutral factor as a substitute intentionally for gender, that would be unfair discrimination by proxy and would be precluded by this definition.
Very good.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Next question, or next discussion from a legislator.
Yes, I'm here.
Pardon?
This is Edmund Jordan.
Okay, Jordan from Louisiana, right?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, and fine. Right ahead.
Great. You know, I guess I take somewhat a different, have a somewhat different sentiment to this. I've looked at it, and I certainly, with all due respect, I don't see this as a move forward. I actually believe that this is probably a step backwards. You know, I listened to your definition, and you spent a whole bunch of time on proxy, the first word in the definition, but not a whole lot on discrimination. And so discrimination, I'll just give you, since you gave a whole bunch of definitions for proxy: discrimination, bigotry, hatred, inequity, injustice, intolerance, prejudice, unfairness. Look, I would tell you, if we're not dealing with the disparate impact of it, or that portion of it, then I'm really not sure of what the purpose of the committee is. We talk about these words, but definitions are fluid. So the president, it's like if I said you were a bad man. It's context. It could mean that you're bad, you're awful, or whatever, but it also mean that you're good, that you may be great. If I say Patrick Ewing is a bad player, that mean he's awful, probably mean he's good. Same thing I would say with Jordan and Biles. So to take the opportunity to talk about definitions, the truth of the matter is we can define a word to mean what we want it to mean within an organization or within an industry. So that part, I just have a disagreement with. I would tell you, you know, there's a comment that was made years before I was born that said, you can't stick a knife 9 inches in my back and pull it out 3 and call that progress. You can't pull it out all the way and call that progress. You have to heal the wound that created the injury. You know, I just think that, frankly, I just think that folks have been discriminating, and not this committee, and I'm not talking about anybody individually, but I think as an industry, there may be some fear on how we get there, how we make a profit without these factors in place. My thing is, I think we need to have an opportunity and make an effort to try to get to that place.
Yeah.
I think this is well intended. You know, this is only the second meeting on this. I don't necessarily think that you can fix this in one meeting and then a vote on in a second meeting. But if that's the attempt, then so be it. I understand that there are efforts to move forward. And I believe everybody in good faith wants to move forward on this. But
Is the,
this for me, this does not, I don't think this gets us to the place that we need to be. So I just think that there's more work that needs to be done on this. I think we do have to have those difficult discussions. And I don't think that you lead merely by not wanting to be left behind. I understand that there are other entities that are taking a role and trying to set the definition. But I think the fear of being left behind doesn't necessarily mean that you're a leader on the subject. So I think if we really want to take a position of leadership, then I do think we need a more thoughtful approach. I'm not saying the approach has not been thoughtful, but I think we need a more thoughtful approach on how we do this. And I'm certainly willing to work to get there. And I would ask for a commitment from everybody on the call, certainly for us to at least attempt to get there.
thank you very much, Representative Jarman. I appreciate your comments, and hopefully that's what we're all working for, to get there, to do the right thing, to have a continuing valid insurance industry that does not acknowledge or allow any racism to creep into its rating system. Is it a perfect process? No, because it depends on you and me and a lot of other people to make sure that it does. And along the way, we're going to make mistakes, but hopefully if we're both trying to climb the same mountain, we'll eventually be on the top together. Next question would be Kevin Cahill from the state of New York.
Hello, Senator, and thank you. I don't know if, like me, you are in session right now, but my main device that I do this on is on the Assembly session where we are voting on hopefully the light at the end of the tunnel for the COVID pandemic, that is reclaiming the power that we gave the governor in his emergency powers. If I may, I just want to offer one brief comment, and I certainly want to echo some of the sentiments that were raised by my colleague from Louisiana. That we have a proactive responsibility to root out discrimination wherever it is, but in particular in the area of insurance, where there has been a history, unfortunately, of discriminatory practices in the past. And while I wholeheartedly support and applaud you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. President, Matt and Neil, for your terrific job in moving this issue forward and for making sure that we took the initiative, and for that I will also send kudos to Tom. I do believe that even on this first step, as you described it, Mr. Chairman, we could do more. I understand that there is a traditional sense of proxy discrimination, of requiring an intentional act. However, there is also a belief that proxy discrimination can occur without an intentional act. That is, if the outcome is the desirable outcome, even without having explored intentional acts, it can be determined to be proxy discrimination. And I would refer you not to my own personal analysis of this, but to a recent Iowa Law School Journal article that discusses this very issue, especially in the age of artificial intelligence. And I think, Mr. Chairman, for the purposes of this discussion, what that portends, instead of just accepting that if you don't do something wrong, this is not going to cover you. This definition, which would also say, consider the impact of your actions, consider the impact of your outcome. It would require an affirmative examination of practices. It would require a determination, particularly when it comes to using things like artificial intelligence, that we put in specific checks and balances to be cognizant of areas where discrimination might occur and to take affirmative steps to prevent that. So for those reasons, I unfortunately will not find myself in support of this resolution today. I do, however, do not want that to be interpreted as any slight of the parties involved or the intentions of the parties involved, because I wholeheartedly support you and I salute you for the good work that you're doing. So with that, I'm going to turn my microphone off. I will also add this, as I texted to a few of you. I'm using a backup device, and it's using power faster than I could put power into it. So I may lose you at some point. I hope, Mr. Chairman, that by this comment, I can also be recorded as a negative vote in case I do lose my signal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Assemblyman Cahill. Assemblyman Cahill and I are in the same party, but we frequently disagree. So with that, I'd like to call on Pam Hunter, again from the state of New York. I'm not favoring them. They've just acknowledged that they would like to speak.
And good afternoon, Chair Breslin, and it's good to see everyone today. I too am in the same position as Assemblyman Cahill relative to double zooming at this point. I'd like to +1 my comments with Representative Jordan. I foundationally, I feel that this is not the right direction if we're not talking about systemic, long-standing discrimination in the industry. If you look at long-term decisions that have affected communities like redlining, and if we're talking about today, we're not going to take a person's skin color into consideration. We're going to take away all of that, but we're going to maybe just talk about someone's zip code. Well, I know that there's a couple census tracts where I live that are the highest poverty rates in the entire country for people of color. So disproportionately, they're going to have a negative advantage for loans, for insurance. And I just feel strongly that we can do much better in having a broader conversation. And I know the conversation just started, and we're going to, based on the chair's comments, get more in depth relative to the impacts. But if we don't foundationally start in the right direction, it won't go to where we need it to be. And I do agree that, this can be more thought out. It can take more time. I know this is our second meeting, but I know that there are other agencies or organizations involved, as Edmund had said, relative to, and it's not a race to the finish line. It is making sure that we are making and doing the appropriate steps to right historic wrongs and make sure that we have equity going forward. And I don't think that we're there yet. And it is no disrespect to this organization or to the parties involved trying to get us there. But I feel with, all of our intelligent heads from across the country together that we could do better. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Assemblyman Hunter from New York State. And I'll also say just quietly that anyone who would tell me there hasn't been racism in the industry is deceiving me and not telling the truth. But hopefully we learn by our mistakes, and the old Georgetowniana quote of "He who forgets the past is doomed to repeat it," I think is appropriate, and to continue to talk about what we've done in the past sometimes goes too far. And I think this committee, hopefully, and I hope I'm not being naive, is looking forward. How do we analyze and move on to make sure that we are protected, that all classes legally are protected, and that the insurance area of the economy is at the forefront of making those changes. So that's not meant to be a speech as it is to be an opinion. So next.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
Chairman, may I jump in here for a second? I kind of want to Representative Lehman again, and I guess what I want to do is I think that Representative Jordan, some of Hunter and Cahill have brought up some very good points. I guess I want to get back to, I think we're focusing on the second part of this, which is, are there things within that those rating factors that need to be discussed? And I think the answer to that probably is yes. Let's look at those. But I think I want to go back to the definition of a proxy discrimination. The whole genesis of this is when the NEIC kind of put out this language with no definition, and they're about to make public policy with nothing wrapped around that definition, I think we need to get focused on the definition of that proxy. Where the discrimination portion is on part 2 of what we're going to do, but on this portion here, I think this definition is key to setting a bar out there that says we don't want you playing games if you're going to be moving these pieces of the puzzle around. What pieces then are part of that puzzle might be part of the second half of this discussion. I don't want to cut anybody off, but I think I'm hearing the discussion really focusing on the second part of this committee. I think we need to kind of focus back on the thing we're going to adopt today, I believe is the definition. I think that's what we need to get back focused on. But I don't want to discount what's been said, but I also want to make sure that we're focusing on the definition that we want to put out there as can go into law so that it can't be used improperly by departments and by carriers.
Thank you, Mr.
So
President.
sorry to interrupt, but that's
Not at
just, I
all.
want to see us kind of
The
get back on
president
that
can
track.
always interrupt.
Try not to.
And the next speaker? And the next, who would, member of the committee, if you'd like to ask a question, please announce yourself. Are there any legislators outside of the committee who would like to ask questions? Then we can move on. If that's so, we can move on to interested persons. And I would say there's a number of people who would like to testify. First would be Frank O'Brien of the APCIA. But yeah, and just a reminder that for all speakers, there's a 5-minute time limit. I sometimes forget to do that because I don't adhere to it when I'm speaking.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I have found through the years that many rules often don't apply to the electeds during the course of a meeting.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman. And for the record, Frank O'Brien, I'm with APCIA. And as you know, we are a national P&C insurance company trade association. And our member companies write a substantial portion of the insurance sold across the country. First, let me thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the members of the special committee for your work on this important issue. As the comments today have shown, it hasn't been easy. We don't think it's going to get any easier, but few things that are important ever are easy. Second, as far as the proposed definition is concerned we join with you, Mr. Chairman, and with Representative Lehman and other members of the committee in urging its adoption. In proposing, debating, and we hope adopting this proposed definition, NCOIL is laying down a marker. It is an initial statement of public policy. By acting in a space where others have not, NCOIL fulfills its essential role in assisting lawmakers and others on issues of importance to the state-based system of insurance regulation. And that's what this committee and this organization is doing today and will continue to do, I'm sure, in the future. And I expect we'll do so as we continue to debate on these issues at the spring meeting. And finally, I would note that NCOIL's definition of proxy discrimination is entirely consistent with the dominant body of case law. It is what the law is now, as opposed to what others might want the law to be. The law, as we know, is a dynamic force, a dynamic object, and is through debate, consideration, and discussion such as this that change is achieved. But change begins with a first step. In this committee, this definition is the first step. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. Any questions for Mr. O'Brien? Thank you very much. Oh, excuse me. Question? No questions? Okay, we'll move on to Erin Collins from NAMIC. Ms. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Erin Collins from NAMIC. Appreciate the time. We are supportive of the NCOIL direction and concept of both identifying proxy discrimination as a space for action, as well as the connection of the concept of intent as it is applied here. We absolutely agree that unfair discrimination includes this definition, and it is absolutely prohibited and has no place in our industry. I want to hit just a couple of points to explain why, in our view, connection to intentionality is the only viable path for a definition of proxy discrimination. First, there's been quite a lot said about applying a disparate impact analysis to property casualty insurance, or just looking at the outcomes of underwriting and rating and setting aside risk profiles and actuarial science. Excuse me. Here's a challenge. And that means that applying risk classification based on scientific evidence would be disallowed if the outcome was disproportionate. And I can't think of a single factor anywhere that could survive that test. It's not out of an aversion to examining and having an honest discussion about underwriting and rating. It's just that an outcome approach just does not work with risk-based pricing. Even if individuals only belong to one protected class instead of multiple, there is very little feasibility that outcomes would directly align with demographics. And what do I mean? So let's take the factor of age of a vehicle, which is a good one because it can work both ways. If it's new, it has a bunch of computers and sensors. If it's old, maybe it doesn't have safety features and is more susceptible to severity. I have a car that's 2 years old. And according to a Pew Research study that I found, 5% of American women have one of my protected class characteristics. And that's a little over 8 million people. Well, what if of those women, a disproportionate number drive cars that are 2 years old compared to the rest of the population? Now, my insurance carrier doesn't know, nor do they want to know about my 5% characteristic. But if you apply a typical disparate impact analysis to the factor of age of the vehicle, two things happen. One, it's highly likely that age of the vehicle doesn't survive that test and is disallowed as a factor. And now my neighbor driving the average age vehicle is going to have to subsidize my newer car. And the second thing that happens, and this is important to me as an individual, is that because my insurance carrier will have to test all of their underwriting variables and show that testing and proof it out to regulators in this way, all of a sudden my carrier is going to have to ask me about my 5% characteristic. And they'll have to ask, they'll have to track it, store it. Now, some people are going to tell you that I'm engaging in hyperbole or it's too blunt of an instrument that I'm using, or somehow don't understand how a disparate impact standard would really be applied. And you know what, maybe they're right, because regulators probably wouldn't start by going after age of the vehicle as a factor. Many would pick and choose where to apply the standard and issue declarations about individual factors, or reject filings as they had time or resources to do that. And I don't consider that a fair system, but I can certainly see the practicality of that outcome. But that's not the whole story here. If we divorce, when we're talking about this broad concept of proxy discrimination, if we divorce this from the concept of intentionality and use disparate impact as an underwriting standard, as some are asking you all to do, then insurance companies will be, I think, universally pulled into bad faith litigation on every single factor that they use, no matter what the regulators do. And I don't think that that's anyone's intent. So what's the answer? Well, we think this definition is a good initial way forward. We're all trying to engage and discuss what industry's role can be in combating systemic racism in America. When I listen to people a whole lot smarter than I am talk about potential solutions, whether it's in the justice system, the economy, talent pipeline, what comes up over and over again is access. And access helps. access to insurance, increased products and coverages because of competition, decreasing risk through mitigation and that resulting in more access, how we can attract new and diverse talent into this industry. Those are things we can and should focus on. And I'm looking forward to that conversation with this committee. But upending decades of actuarial science and applying something that isn't risk-based is not going to create access in the market. I think it will constrict the market and make it hard to know what insurance to write and how much and for how many people. And I just don't think that's the answer. So creating a competitive market, a highly competitive market with lots of companies to choose from, with the ability to match rate to risk, that has the potential to increase access. And that's where we should start. So for that reason, we're supportive of the NCOIL language and we encourage the committee toward that end. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Collins. Any questions? Thank you again. And next on the speaker list is an old friend, Bernie Birnbaum. You are up.
Thank you. Good afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Bernie Birnbaum with the Center for Economic Justice, which is a consumer organization, former insurance regulator who has worked on sort of racial justice issues in insurance since 1991. Wow. And we appreciate NCOIL's efforts to examine the impact of systemic racism on insurer practices and insurance companies. However, the proposed revisions reflect a profound misunderstanding of how systemic racism affects insurance. By defining proxy discrimination only as intentional use of a proxy characteristic for a protected class, the revisions, if adopted, would memorialize insurer practices that discriminate indirectly on the basis of race, would discourage insurers from examining the racial impact of their practices, and would restrict current regulatory efforts to address such unfair discrimination. It's fundamentally incorrect to claim that proxy discrimination must involve intent. The argument misunderstands how bias affects insurance outcomes. The proposal basically takes the view that unless you intend to discriminate, there can be no discrimination, and relieves insurers of any responsibility to test their practices for systemic bias. The realistic view is that systemic racism and historic discrimination can be reflected and perpetuated in so-called neutral factors. Literally everyone outside of the insurance industry trade associations understands that big data algorithms can reflect and reproduce historic discrimination, and that presence of systemic racism demands proactive examination of insurer practices for unnecessary racial discrimination. It's also factually incorrect that disparate impact analysis harms risk-based pricing. Such analysis is completely consistent with actuarial practice. So I want to get to the type of disproportionate impact that's tied to the use of proxies for prohibited characteristics and not to the outcomes. In earlier conversations, we described one such situation where insurers were using age and value of the home as underwriting factors for home insurance, with the result that communities of color were systemically denied home insurance because these communities were characterized by older, lower value homes, results directly tied to historic discrimination in housing. When challenged, the insurers discovered that the factors they were using, age and value, were more correlated with race than with insurance outcomes. As a result of the disparate impact challenge, the insurers moved to more relevant risk factors, such as the condition of the home and its systems, with the result that insurance became more available in communities of color, and there was a better correlation between risk classifications and outcomes. This second type of impact involves intentional or unintentional, unnecessary discrimination on the basis of race. It's unnecessary because the facially neutral factor that is purportedly associated with the insurance outcome is, in whole or in part, a proxy for the protected class characteristic and predictive of that class characteristic and not the outcome. Stated differently, the facially neutral factor has a spurious correlation to the insurance outcome and is really correlated to the protected class characteristic. So we were going to suggest to you that a better definition of proxy discrimination to really get at that unnecessary type of racial discrimination would be proxy discrimination is the use of a non-prohibited factor that due in whole or in part to a significant correlation with a protected class characteristic causes unnecessary disproportionate outcomes on the basis of protected class membership. So I'll finish up by just saying that a few things. First, any effort to address systemic racism and proxy discrimination has to apply to all aspects of insurers' operations, not just pricing and underwriting. For example, you could be marketing based on protected class factors directly or indirectly, and that wouldn't be prohibited by these revisions. Yet with big data analytics, insurers can micro-target specific customers, focusing on those they view as high value and excluding those they view as low value, with the result that those so-called low value customers who happen to be in communities of color would never see preferred offers. Similarly, for anti-fraud and claim settlement, companies are using big data algorithms and sources of data, such as facial analytics, that are known to have a strong bias. The other 2 points I'll finish up with are, one, industry admits that the proposed revisions add no new tools or resources for regulators. During the December 9th meeting, I asked Mr. Chapo whether it was his position that if a regulator discovered an insurer using a perfect proxy for race, could the regulator take action to stop that discriminatory practice? And he offered the view that regulators have that authority. So given that view, the proposed revisions not only fail to add any new tools, but actually restrict activities that insurance regulators have long engaged in to stop the use of blatant proxies. Now they would somehow have to prove intent, where currently regulators work on things that they know have an unnecessary and unfairly disproportionate impact. So in closing, we urge NCOIL to reject the proposed definition of proxy discrimination, and we hope that your intent is to address the impacts of systemic racism in insurance. If that's the case, the proposed revisions accomplish just the opposite and would memorialize such unnecessary proxy discrimination. Happy to answer questions, and thanks for the opportunity to visit.
Thank you, Bernie. Any questions, Mr. Birnbaum? Okay. Then thank you again, Bern. The next witness will be Matt Chapo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I unmuted properly. Yes, I'd like to speak for a couple of minutes, particularly because my prior testimony was just cited. In response to Mr. Birnbaum, in direct response, since he referred to me, but also a few other points, I guess I got a few things. One, yeah, I think that the description of my testimony from December isn't accurate. The idea that he asked me a question about a perfect proxy and then I gave a particular response doesn't conform in my memory, or I think the record of the hearing. I don't think I was asked any questions by him, nor do I think I could have been at an NCOIL hearing. NCOIL, to my knowledge, doesn't only allows committee members to question witnesses, not other members not other witnesses to question witnesses. Also, I think that the testimony I gave about the subject is quite a bit more nuanced than that. I did offer a view on the general subject that I thought the language in the current prohibition against rating based on a protected class like race should be understood to cover proxy discrimination. I've got a long-standing concern about regulators sometimes not using the tools they have before they seek more, and that informed my position that I just recited. I was also particularly concerned about moving toward a definition that could have brought in the same kind of disparate impact outcome under the guise of proxy discrimination that's reflected in the CEJ submission. The submission there talks about proxy discrimination, but it's clearly about disparate impact, and the distinctions between the two have been well covered at this meeting and the prior meeting. So that's another thing that informed my the statement in question. But bottom line is that NCOIL, as I understand it, felt strongly needed to define proxy discrimination. I think it had particular, for the same reasons that I just discussed, particularly the idea that without a definition, it could bleed over into disparate impact. NCOIL has mentioned that NEIC has adopted a proxy discrimination standard without defining the term. So as a practical matter, that's the position NCOIL has taken, and I think it makes perfect sense. And as I also said in December, another accuracy point is I believe on this question about the age and value of the house, there's a reference to insurers and finding that there was that there was a correlation to race and not a correlation to risk. There wasn't a citation to this assertion in the CJ letter, but the best I could guess was that it probably referenced some discrimination in the 1980s under a federal anti-discrimination statute. And I think the statement was that when challenged, the insurers discovered that the factors they were using, age and value of the home, were more correlated with race than with insurance outcomes. I'm not aware that there's anything in the record that says that insurers found that they concluded that they were using factors that were more correlated with race than insurance outcomes. I think what you had there was a very specific federal statute under which litigation was brought that only pertains to housing, and thus on the insurance world, the homeowners insurance, and that the defendant insurance companies, as rational actors will do in litigation, entered into settlement agreements that may have affected the types of factors they use. That doesn't mean that they concluded that they were correlating with race and insurance outcomes. So I mean, those factual quibbles, I think, kind of funnel into the basic disagreement, which is the most important point. And Bernie and I have had this disagreement on many calls. We just have a different view, and this isn't a factual point. It's coming at it from a different way. I think that that when you're when you're looking at this, it's a question of, do you think that disparate impact on every factor is the way to analyze this, or is it better to funnel into what the president said before, which was part 2, which is an examination of individual factors and a determination of whether their social unfairness outweighs the social fairness of their actuarial justification. And we discussed that. There was a lot of discussion about that in the last hearing, and I think it's been brought up again here. And my view, and obviously the members who aren't going to support the definition, that they have their view, and that's their view. But my view is that I think that the concerns raised by those members are very important concerns. But I do believe that that part 2, the discussion of individual factors and the legislators' application of their political judgment on whether their social unfairness outweighs their actual fairness, I think that's the well-established way that legislators have addressed these problems in the past. And I believe that with your authority to regulate commerce, that you can bring out fair outcomes in that manner. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope I didn't take too much time. Mr. Chairman, you're muted now.
Not anymore. Any questions for that? Okay. Hearing none, are there any? There is none. No more witnesses listed. Is there anyone else who would like to offer any testimony?
Senator, this is Bernie. May I offer just a couple of comments in response to Mr. Chapo?
Bernie, I've never denied you, so you have a minute. Yes, I will let you go way over the first time.
Oh, thank you. So first, the record is clear that in the last meeting, I did ask Mr. Chapo that question, and he did respond as set out in our letter. The second is that it was not the 1980s, it was the 1990s, and it was a disparate impact claim brought under the Federal Fair Housing Act. And the fact that it was brought under the Federal Fair Housing Act doesn't really have any sort of problem with the issue of whether disparate impact analysis is relevant and useful for insurance and whether it promotes better risk-based pricing or whether it harms. And the evidence is that disparate impact analysis improves risk-based pricing. Industry has never been able to provide a single example of how it's harmed risk-based pricing. But the fundamental problem here is that the proposal is conflating two issues. It's conflating the types of historic discrimination that leads to embedded outcomes, such as shorter life expectancies for Black Americans or certain diseases that Black Americans suffer. That type of outcome that can't be separated from actuarial analysis.
I understand.
The type of issue that we're talking about here can be separated from the outcomes. And that's where the problem lies. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bernie. Is there anyone else?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
just not that it's the end of the world, but we have two people like this on a point of fact. You as chairman, I don't believe would have allowed one interested party to ask another interested party a question at an NCOIL hearing. We've never seen it done before. Our records of the December 9th meeting don't reflect that occurred. Perhaps Mr. Birnbaum is thinking of an NAIC meeting. It didn't occur at our hearing.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Considine. And with that, I will move on and ask for, with no further witnesses, ask for a motion to adopt the model.
Well, can I make a comment just before we do that, Mr. Chairman?
Certainly.
Thank you. Look, I guess, look, here's my immediate
It's not coming in.
concern. This is Edmund Jordan. So my immediate concern is this. Can you hear me at all?
Yes, now we can.
You can hear me. Okay, great. One, what exactly are we accomplishing? And it just seems that we're creating a definition for this proxy discrimination. And then I guess I asked myself, and that's in response, I assume, based on the comments, in response to the NAIC. And then the question is, well, does this definition eliminate or mitigate discrimination? In my opinion, then that's no. And so then I go back to the first question, and that's, what are we accomplishing? Because, I think it's almost like the Hippocratic Oath. I think the position is we should be doing no harm. And I just think that this, if we adopt this definition, we're probably doing more harm, in my opinion, than good. I would tell you, here's part of the issue, and I wanted to wait.
Representative Jordan, I let you go over the first time. I don't want to let you go over and have everybody else upset that they weren't given the same opportunities.
I will.
I am discriminating against them in favor of you.
Mr. Chairman, it's your party. That's fine. All I will say is this, and I'll leave it with this. If we will substitute gender for race, and you're hearing from the people who it immediately affects, and you move forward, then are they really being heard? And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Representative. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Second. Okay, we'll do a roll call vote.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Assemblyman Ken Cooley.
Aye. Well, is the motion
Aye.
to adopt, Mr. Breslin?
Okay, I'm sorry, is someone trying to speak?
Restate the motion to adopt it, definitely.
Okay, there was a motion by Senator Holdman and a second by Representative Fisher to adopt the model. And then we're proceeding with the roll call. Assemblyman Ken Cooley is a yes.
Correct.
Senator Travis Holdman,
Aye.
Indiana Representative Matt Lehman,
Yes.
Kentucky Representative Joe Fisher,
Yes.
Kentucky Representative Bart Rowland,
Yes.
Louisiana Representative Edmund Jordan,
No.
Michigan Representative Brenda Carter, okay, the record is showing that Representative Carter is no longer on the call. We have New York Assemblyman Kevin Cahill's no vote on record.
No, I'm still here, but I'm leaving. And I know Assemblywoman Hunter wished to leave a no vote as well, but we'll get to that.
Okay, Assemblywoman woman Pam Hunter is next. And is she still
No.
on?
No, I vote no.
Okay. Ohio Senator Bob Hackett
Yes.
and New York Senator Chair Breslin.
Yes.
So the motion passes 7-3, Mr. Chairman.
Very good. Thank you very much. And we're just going to, a discussion on April's meeting. I note that that for the committee's April meeting, we currently have a presentation scheduled to be delivered by Professor Peter Kokenberger of the University of Connecticut Law School regarding insurers' use of criminal history and underwriting. And I would like to offer the opportunity to all those on this call, to offer suggestions as to other topics for the committee that we should discuss at the April meeting. Any legislators have any other business? Is there any other business? I accept a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Motion made by Kevin Cale of New York, second by Senator Travis Ullman. All those in favor say aye.
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 You guys have it. Thank you all very much for a very productive meeting.
Thanks, everyone.